Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Chapman, the president of Discovery Institute. I'm happy to welcome you here on a warm afternoon to talk about human exceptionalism. When he was the bishop and then the cardinal of Poland, the future John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, used the phrase, the question, what does it mean to be human? And addressed it to the society in which he lived. And it was a penetrating rhetorical question that the communist regime at that time could not answer. And I think it applies to a lot of things, and it applies especially to this subject of the radical animal rights movement and the debates that take place among a number of people in a number of places in this country about that subject. So we're very happy today to have with us our senior fellow Wesley J. Smith, and he is part of the this is part of the McNaughton Fellows lecture series that we hold throughout the year that allows fellows to report on work that's in progress. Now, the work that's in progress here is a book on animal rights, and I'm smiling because we're eager to get it done and out, and so Wesley has been working hard on it. Wesley Smith is actually a very versatile and interesting public policy intellectual with a long and distinguished career. In fact, at one time he was working closely with Ralph Nader and his group, and co-authored some books with Ralph Nader on various topics. And somewhere along the line there was some transition in his life, and he wound up working on a constellation of issues that spread from euthanasia, which he has written about, to assisted suicide, embryonic stem cells, the Terry Schiavo case, and it goes on. And, of course, animal rights. He is a lawyer. You will understand when you hear him. He's trained in public speaking. He's an international lecturer. In fact, it seems like every time I fire up my computer, I'm getting an email from him of some new lecture and some new debate that he's engaged in around the world: Canada, the United States, South Africa, Mexico, Australia, Europe, and so forth. He's an attorney for the International Task Force on Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, and he's a consultant for the Center for Bioethics and Culture. But we claim him mainly as a senior fellow of Discovery Institute and the head of our bioethics program. He is a leader in this field, and in fact, I think he may be unique on this side of the constellation of issues. The National Journal has named him as one of the nation's top expert thinkers on bioengineering and bioethics issues. As I said, he has made speeches around the world, but also written articles for a whole parade of interesting and important periodicals and newspapers here in the rest of the world, and he's the author now of a total of 11 books. He has a weekly podcast called Brave New Bioethics, which presents his views, and you can listen to them on our website, our Discovery Institute website. And he also has a blog, which we carry, called Secondhand Smoke, which deals with a lot of issues. Now, I could go on and on about his great record, but I think I'd rather let him tell you about one of the most penetrating and difficult issues of our time, and one we've heard a lot about, but I think we're destined to hear far more about in the months and years to come. Please welcome Wesley Smith.
His picture also appears in post office walls across the country. Thank you, Bruce, very much for having me here. I asked Bruce before we came in, I said, how long would you like me to speak? He said, 25 minutes. I'm a lawyer. It takes me that long to clear my throat. what we are talking about today is human exceptionalism. We're going to talk a little bit about bioethics, and we are going to talk about the animal liberation movement. And I bring up the animal liberation movement precisely because it needs to be distinguished from animal welfare. Animal welfare is an important and noble goal of ever pressuring us and challenging us to increase our humanity, to increase the humane way in which we treat animals. Animal rights is something completely different. Animal rights creates a moral equivalency between animals and humans. And in fact, not only in its explicit advocacy, but in its implications, animal rights is anti-human. But before we get to that, let's talk about the question of human exceptionalism and what I mean by that term. I think the question of the 21st century really is, does human life have intrinsic value simply and merely because it is human? In other words, is there anything other than being human that provides us with special moral value? Or is that sufficient in and of itself? I say yes. Being human in and of itself is sufficient to convey intrinsic moral value. That's the sanctity of life ethic. It's also the equality of life ethic. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and of course women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That is a wonderful sentence that powerfully sets forth the equality of life ethic, or the concept of being human in and of itself, granting rights, granting value. If we say no to the question, though, does human life, does being human in and of itself give moral value, then we have to ask another question. Well, what does? If it isn't being human, if being human in and of itself is not what conveys value, what does convey value? And across a very broad array of advocacies and ideologies today, the answer to the question I posed is being answered no. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Philosophical materialism, as one example, says that there's nothing special about being human because we evolved with all other life on this planet out of the same primordial ooze. Many neo-Darwinists will even say there's no such thing as species distinctions because we share so many genes with other species. And this leads to, if that's your first principle, that being human is not what gives value, that really we're just another animal in the forest, beef on the hoof, if you will, then that leads to other thinking that can affect human rights and affect how we treat the most weak and vulnerable among us. Thus, a fellow named John Darnton wrote this in the San Francisco Chronicle. "We are all of us dogs and barnacles, pigeons and crabgrass, the same in the eyes of nature, equally remarkable and equally dispensable." That's a very frightening thought. That's a very frightening statement when you think about the implications of this. John Derbyshire of National Review fame has similarly written that a Darwinian understanding of biology leads to the conclusion that human beings are, quote, "only special in the way that an elephant is special by virtue of having that long trunk. We are part of nature, an exceptionally advanced and interesting part, but not special." Well, if that's the case, if we're not special, if being human in and of itself does not provide us value, then those human beings who are deemed to be less worthy of life or less worthy of protection are going to get it in the neck. And in fact, that's been the history of the human race. We have gone after each other based on nationality. We've gone after each other based on religion. We've gone after each other based on gender. And that's what we're trying to overcome. We're trying to raise ourselves outside of that. They used to leave babies, disabled infants on hills in Greece and Rome. We're trying to lift ourselves out of that kind of barbarity. At least it used to be considered barbarity, but it's coming back. And the reason it's coming back, infanticide in the Netherlands, for example, takes 8% of all infants who die in the Netherlands are killed by doctors. If you believe that human life doesn't have intrinsic value and a baby is born with severe challenges, then the lethal injection begins to become logical. We're not so crude as to leave them on a hill to be eaten by wolves, but the outcome is the same, one dead baby. And in the Netherlands, the response to doctors killing babies is to legalize infanticide, which is now coming down the pike in the parliament of the Netherlands. And you've seen pro-infanticide articles appear in the New York Times, in the Los Angeles Times, and in the New England Journal of Medicine, just to name a few. And that all flows from saying no to the question I posed. Because if you say yes to the question I posed, that infant, no matter how capable or incapable, how disabled or what state of health, would be deemed to have equal moral value as the rest of us. And infanticide would be out of the question. Proper care would be what would be required. So you see, if you say yes to the question I posed and no, you begin to see very divergent ways in which we treat the weak and vulnerable, and especially the powerless. Another ideology that says no to whether being human in and of itself gives moral value, that says no to human exceptionalism, is the deep ecology movement. I won't spend a lot of time on that tonight, but the deep ecology movement says not only that are human beings not special and not unique and not having the highest moral value, it says we are the vermin species on the living planet Gaia. And therefore we must reduce to protect the earth. It's almost a nature religion. We have to reduce human population to beneath 1 billion. Well, how do you get to that place? Well, they talk about people voluntarily not having children. Yeah, right. That's going to get us beneath 1 billion. I spoke in Warsaw recently, and I've been to Auschwitz now and Birkenau. I've seen the evil that can happen when an ideology so adamantly says no to the question I posed. I've stood in gas chambers. I'm not saying that deep ecologists want to engage in death camps, but I can't see any other way the implication of their advocacy. They often hope, for example, hopefully we'll have an endemic or a pandemic and we'll wipe out the human species. You can see that for yourself by doing some Google searches. But you're not going to get there by accident. You'd have to get there through intentionality, and that intentionality could lead to barbarism. And again, what we believe, what we think, our first principles matters to how we treat each other and how we treat the planet. Another group that says no to the question I posed are the futuristic transhumanists. How many of you have heard of transhumanism? A couple. Transhumanism is a futuristic ideology. It's almost a religion. It is extremely materialistic, but it believes that being human in and of itself is inadequate to a good life, and that what we need to do is enhance ourselves and create the capacity to become post-human. And so they want to engage in genetic engineering. They want to learn how to upload our minds into computers. They believe that we'll be able to live forever, or near forever, hundreds of years anyway, through these machinations. And they remind me of a Woody Allen joke. They believe that humans are not good enough and smart enough. Therefore, we have to take us from where we are now and move us into this post-human species. And it's like that Woody Allen joke where one woman has gone to a restaurant and she talks to her friend, and the second woman says, "So how was the restaurant?" And the first woman says, "Terrible. The food was terrible and awful in such small portions." Get it? Bad food, small portions. I think it's funny when Woody Allen tells the joke. But that's exactly what it is. They are dissatisfied. It's very sad, actually, with the state of being human, and they yearn for some form of technology that will bring them that exalted state that they deeply desire. And I think, frankly, they miss out on the joys of being human. Then there's the bioethics movement, which I wrote about in the book Culture of Death, The Assault on Medical Ethics in America. The bioethics movement, utilitarian bioethicists, say being human is not what gives value, because to say that one has special value because you're human in and of itself would be speciesist. That is discrimination against animals. And so the idea in utilitarian bioethics is that being a person is what gives value, which is not the same. Used to be that a human being and a person were synonyms. They're not in this view. In this view, being a person, you have to have sufficient cognitive capacities to be self-aware over time, for example. So in this belief, there is such a thing as a human non-person. And who would be the human non-persons? All unborn human life, fetuses and embryos, are not persons in this view, because an embryo, an early embryo in particular, doesn't even have a nervous system. Fetuses are not conscious, they're not self-aware over time, they cannot value their own lives. So all unborn lives are considered non-persons. That might not be surprising, but in bioethics also, and this is the general view, it's not the unanimous view, I'm talking about the primary view in bioethics. There are people with different opinions. But in bioethics, a newborn infant is not a person, because a newborn infant isn't self-aware over time. A newborn infant can't value his or her own life. Some bioethicists will say, well, instead of calling an infant a non-person, let's call them a potential person, which will allow us to treat them as if they were persons, even though they're not. Well, that provides very scant protection for people who have lost these capacities. For example, my Uncle Bruno Micheletti. My Uncle Bruno Micheletti died of Alzheimer's disease. Now, when one of my early memories, and a very happy memory, was when my Uncle Bruno Micheletti came to my house when I was about 3 or 4, and I remember him picking me up, and he was pretending to throw me off a slope at my folks' house. And I was laughing and giggling because I knew my Uncle Bruno Micheletti wasn't going to throw me off the slope. And he's pretending to throw me off, and here we go, and I remember his black hair was flying. And I'm laughing and giggling, and of course, he didn't throw me off the slope. Now, fast forward about 54 years, and my Uncle Bruno Micheletti's a little old man in a wheelchair with bald head. He can't see very well because of glaucoma, and he has Alzheimer's, and he doesn't even remember his daughter's name. He didn't recognize his daughter when she came to see him. In bioethics, they would say, my Uncle Bruno Micheletti was no longer a person. I say, of course he was a person, because you have to answer yes to the question I posed. And in fact, not only is a person, but because of these deficiencies he now has, because of this illness, he even has a greater claim to our concern, a greater claim to our commitment, a greater claim to our love. But if you say no, and you take Bruno Micheletti, my Uncle Bruno, and say, well, he's not a person anymore, that leads to places. That leads to the potential exploitation of people like my uncle. So, for example, some in bioethics say that a human non-person, doesn't have the right to life. Some say that a human non-person can be exploited as if they were mere animals or instrumentalities. Thus, Tom Beecham, who's a bioethicist who co-authored the most important book in bioethics called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics, wrote in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, December 1999, because many humans lack properties of personhood or are less than full persons, they are thereby rendered equal or inferior in moral standing to some non-humans. If this condition is defensible, we will need to rethink our traditional view that these unlucky humans cannot be treated in ways we treat relevantly similar non-humans. For example, they might be aggressively used as human research subjects or sources of organs. Now you might say, well, no one would ever seriously propose that. They do seriously propose that. This is an article from Critical Care Medicine, which is the medical journal for the intensive care docs. 2 Harvard doctors, quote, we propose that individuals who desire to donate their organs and who are either neurologically devastated or imminently dying should be allowed to donate their organs without first being declared dead. It's not happening, I want to emphasize, this is not happening in the hospitals and transplant centers, but the only reason it's not happening is because I think many in the ethical community, so-called, know that most people still hold to the idea that being human has value and that you don't treat human beings as a mere corn crop ripe for the harvest. The same issues at stake in the human cloning debate and the embryonic stem cell debate, where we're going to take nascent human life and say that because this nascent human life it does not have certain capacities, that we can create it for the purpose of using it as an instrumentality. And people say, well, in an early embryo, who cares? It doesn't have a brain or a nervous system. But what about fetuses? New Jersey has legalized creating cloned human embryos, implanting them in women, and gestating them through the 9th month. And only requires that these cloned fetuses be killed prior to the moment of birth. that cannot yet be done technologically, but it has been legalized because it shows you what can happen when you say no to the question I posed. You can begin to look at some human lives as having less value than other human lives. In fact, you do, by definition. And therefore, if some are powerful and have greater value than those who are less powerful, you end up going after the people who are less powerful. It's the history of the human race. The only antidote to that is human exceptionalism, universal human moral worth, based simply and merely on the objective standard of being human. Now, the animal rights movement, which is going to take up the rest of this talk, has a different view. They accept the concept of speciesism. They say you cannot say that being human has higher moral value than an animal, because to do so is to discriminate against animals. That's speciesism. So the question then is, well, what do you animal rights advocates say gives moral value? One approach is the Gary Francione approach. Gary Francione is a Rutgers University law professor who wants animals to be able to bring lawsuits in their own name in courts. And of course, this wouldn't be the animals bringing the lawsuits. It would be the animal liberationists bringing the lawsuits, using the animal who would have no idea what was going on as the front. But he believes that sentience, mere sentience alone, gives value. Therefore, since animals are sentient, they are awake, they can feel pain, and so forth, then they are deemed to be at least equal in the sense that we cannot make any use of them whatsoever. So that in Gary Francione's worldview, it is wrong to have seeing eye dogs, because that is a form of enslavement. You are treating sentient beings as property, and that is evil. I've talked to him, I've debated him. He's quite adamant about this, that merely being sentient gives value, at least to the point where you cannot be used as an instrumentality, or you cannot be owned. And Gary Francione advocates that there be no domestic animals of any kind, because to have any domestic animals of any kind is to engage in slaveholding, and therefore it is wrong. Another approach is what is called painience, P-A-I-N-I-E-N-C-E. That is, the ability to feel pain is what gives human value. And let me just give you a quick taste of this. This is from a fellow named Richard Ryder, who wrote, he's a professor, of course, aren't they all? He's a professor emeritus at, he was the Mellon professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. And he wrote this. And this is in The Guardian, Saturday, August 6, 2005. Our concern for the pain and distress of others should be extended to any painient, pain-feeling being, regardless of his or her sex, class, race, religion, nationality, or species. Indeed, if aliens from outer space turned out to be painient, or if we ever manufacture machines who are painient, then we must widen the moral circle to include them. Painience is the only convincing basis for attributing rights or indeed interests to others. So, since a cow feels pain and a human being feels pain, cattle ranching is literally equivalent to human slavery in this view. And think about that. This is not a metaphor. This is not symbolism. This is fervently believed. Cattle ranching becomes as evil as human slavery. Animal research, trying to cure cancer using mice and other animals, becomes Mengele in the concentration camps. And now, having visited a concentration camp, I find that analogy even more offensive, because I have seen the face of true evil in the concentration camps. And to say that normal practices of animal husbandry are the same thing as killing Jews by the millions is reprehensible. If a KKK or an Aryan Nation type person said that same thing, they would be condemned as bigots. And yet animal liberationists say it all the time. And if you doubt it, let me read you something from the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals take the painiance view, only they expand it to suffering. And their belief is that any entity or being that can suffer is basically equal as in terms of their value, as I just read to you from terms of painiance. And they had what was called the Holocaust on Your Plate campaign for a couple of years, which went around to the universities and the colleges, basically stating, as pushing vegetarianism, and I have no problem if people want to be vegetarian, but they basically were saying that to eat meat is the same thing as the Holocaust. That's why they called it the Holocaust on Your Plate campaign. And here's what they said, and this is from, they would juxtapose, for example, I don't think you can see it, but pictures of the concentration camps victims in the bunk beds, the wooden bunk beds, with caged chickens, as if they were the same thing. On another picture that was even more offensive, they had a pile of stacked dead Jews next to a pile of stacked dead pigs. Now that's offensive on very many levels. But to make that kind of moral equivalence tells me that they have no business preaching or arguing morality with anyone, because they don't even understand the concept. To equate those two things, and to write this and advocate it for 2 years before they issued what was one of those classic non-apology apologies. I'm sorry if you were offended for what we wrote. Quote, like people, animals desire the freedom to lead their lives in their own way. Well, that's anthropomorphizing, but let's not go there. Like us, they suffer and feel fear. Like the Jews murdered in concentration camps, animals are terrorized when they are housed in cramped, filthy warehouses and rounded up for shipment to slaughter. The leather sofa and handbag are the modern equivalent of the lampshades made from the skins of the people killed in the death camps. Close quote. And they mean this seriously. This is what I must convey to you. You wonder why you see so much violence beginning to happen in terms of animal liberation. It's because precisely they believe what I just described literally. Would you act violently to stop the trains from going to Auschwitz? I would. I hope I would. Let's put it this way. I hope that I would do what I could to prevent that from occurring. And the more radical aspects of the animal liberation movement believe the same thing about research. There were pipe bombs found under UCLA research scientists' cars down in LA a few weeks ago. You've had in the United Kingdom a family was raising guinea pigs for use in medical research. They raised the guinea pigs properly and humanely. There was nothing, they weren't causing the guinea pigs any pain. They and their town suffered from years of attacks, vandalism, threats from the animal liberationists. And you know how they finally drove this family out of the guinea pig raising business? They robbed the grave of their grandmother and took the body and wouldn't give it back until and unless they stopped raising guinea pigs. And the farm family finally said, look, we give up. We give up. We can't stand against this. There's something called tertiary targeting in animal liberation. This was created by a group called Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, or SHAC. And here's how it works. The issue here is to drive a company called Huntington Life Sciences out of business. And the reason they want to drive Huntington Life Sciences out of business is because Huntington Life Sciences engages in medical research. They are a lab for hire. As I'm sure you all know, that various testing is required by law on animals before certain products can be used in humans. And if we can minimize that, we should. As I'll get to in just a moment, a crucial aspect of human exceptionalism isn't just our rights as humans, our value as humans, it is our obligations as humans. But this lab, it's a worldwide lab, does this research. And so Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty created a type of terrorism activity called tertiary targeting. They not only threaten the lives or threaten the safety and health and well-being of people who work at Huntington. They threaten the lives or threaten the well-being. The parents of children might get a videotape of their children at school. If they work at the bank of Huntington Life Science, if they work at the insurance company of Huntington Life Science, if they work as bookkeepers for Huntington Life Science, if they're a contractor going to build a building for Huntington Life Science. And the idea is to make their lives so miserable, to drive their insurance companies away so they won't insure them. They have an online spot where companies can go pledging never to do business with Huntington Life Science again. And if you can't get insurance, if you can't get banks, you can't do business. And this is the big test case. If Huntington Life Science is driven out of business, then McDonald's could be next. The salmon fleet here in Seattle could be next. Animal liberationists and animal rights activists have the right to have a bizarre ideology that thinks animals are equal to people. They have the right to try to convince each and every one of us not to eat meat. They do not have the right to coerce people in this kind of behavior. In fact, the FBI has said that animal rights terrorism is one of the most crucial and most dangerous domestic terrorist threats. When the Wall Street, what is the big stock exchange? New York, thank you. When the New York Stock Exchange was going to list Huntington Life Sciences' parent company on the big board, these shack people put all their personal information up on the internet because they also engage in identity theft. They will give people subscriptions to pornographic magazines, things of that sort. They listed their social security numbers. They then vandalized a yacht of one of the New York Stock Exchange's directors, and so on the very day that this company was going to be listed, the New York Stock Exchange backed off and wouldn't explain why, even in front of a Senate committee. Well, the answer is pretty obvious. And about a year later, they very quietly listed the company, and now there's hell to pay because the shack types want to drive Huntington out of business by any means necessary. Nobody's been murdered yet by animal liberationists except perhaps Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands was assassinated by an animal rights fanatic. We don't know why he killed Pim Fortuyn. There are a lot of theories, but one of the things, Pim Fortuyn, who was a libertarian, wanted to allow mink farming back into the country. Now, who knows why it was done, the man won't say. But if ever a scientist is murdered, and there have been threats of killing of scientists for medical research, and there's a fellow named Jerry Vlasek who has said that murdering 15 or so scientists would save millions of animals, told a Senate committee that killing scientists was justified. If they won't stop peacefully, then they will be made to stop by any means necessary. If that crucial line is ever crossed and somebody is murdered in the name of animal rights, I'm afraid that all restraint will be gone. Because one of the things that I find most of greatest concern is that certainly most animal rights activists are not violent, but I don't see any real restraint on the part of those who are not violent on their colleagues who are. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals has specifically refused to condemn the Animal Liberation Front and SHAC, and indeed compared the Animal Liberation Front, who engages in similar activities, to the French Resistance. Well, I would point out the French Resistance killed people. And they also compared it, which I find odious, to the Underground Railroad that freed slaves. Freeing minks is not freeing slaves. You're not freeing minks, you're exposing them to starvation and deprivation and a terrible death when you let them out of their cages. So I'm going to take some questions here because I've already gone past the 25 minutes. But I want to finish with, I think, the important point about human exceptionalism that often doesn't get discussed, and that is our duties. We are human beings. We not only have value because we're human, we not only have rights because we're human, we alone in the known universe have obligations and duties because we are human. We are a moral species, we are a choosing species, we are a conscious species, we are an empathetic species. We have duties to each other, we have duties to posterity. Remember, our forefathers, we were their posterity, and look what they left us. We understand that, and we have duties to our posterity who will come after we're gone. We have duties to the environment, to keep it clean and reasonably protected. And we have duties to animals. When Michael Vick, assuming he did what he is charged with, when he allowed these dogs to be fighting each other, and they were electrocuted or hanged if they weren't vicious enough, what he did was anti-human. What is the obligation to the dog? It's because of our humanity that we have an obligation not to treat dogs in the way those dogs were treated. If it wasn't our humanity, what was it? Did the dogs have the right not to be treated that way? No, animals cannot possibly have rights. They cannot, not a single animal can understand the concept. In fact, for rights to be rights, they have to apply universally. Would anyone say that the lion who takes down the zebra has violated the zebra's right to life? Of course not. Were the animals acting immorally by fighting to the death? Of course not. Animals can't act morally. Only human beings can act morally or immorally. They were doing what they were trained to do. What went wrong was we, the people involved in that dog fighting ring, diminished their humanity and our humanity by violating their human obligation and their human duty to always treat animals humanely. I gave a speech at Gonzaga Law School about 3 or 4 months ago. And I took a bigger presentation than this. I had more time, but I was talking about human exceptionalism, and I spent at least 10 times saying this isn't just about rights, it's not just about value, it's also about duties. And after the lecture, a fellow raised his hand and he said, human exceptionalism is arrogant, he said it is hubristic, and it means that we can do to animals whatever we want. I said, absolutely not. I said, how many times do I have to say it? But let me ask you, sir, a question. If being human is not what gives us the obligation to treat animals humanely, please tell me what does, because I'd like to know. Remember Jackie Gleason? Homina, homina, homina? He didn't have an answer. There is no answer other than our humanity. In fact, the animal liberationists who argue that animals are equal to people are engaging in an act of human exceptionalism because we're the only species who could have that kind of moral discussion. It's really ironic. Those who would deny human exceptionalism are in the act of engaging in it. I want to finish with the stakes involved, because realize that the animal liberation movement wants to prevent any and all use of animals for any and all purposes. Whether it's medical research, whether it's eventually cats and dogs in our homes, whether it's riding horses, whether it's eating meat, and so forth. And this is, I was reading this on the way up to Seattle today. It's called Drawing the Line, Science in the Case for Animal Rights by Stephen Wise. He's one of the major animal rights leaders. And he points out the incredible stake humans have in the proper and humane use of animals. He doesn't mean to do that, but our society would be incredibly impacted if we could not make proper and humane use of animals. Listen to what he says. The interdependence of present society enmeshed in the use of non-human animals dwarfs 19th century slave society. See the analogy, which is odious and false, but I digress. Then it was possible to avoid complicity in human slavery. Today, the use of non-human animal products is so diverse and widespread that it is impossible to live in modern society and not support the non-human animal industry directly. For example, the blood of a slaughtered cow is used to manufacture plywood adhesives, fertilizer, fire extinguisher foam, and dyes. Her fat helps make plastic, tires, crayons, cosmetics, lubricants, soaps, detergents, cough syrup, contraceptive jellies and creams, ink, shaving cream, fabric softeners, synthetic rubber, jet engine lubricants, textiles, corrosion inhibitors, and metal machine lubricants. Her collagen is found in pie crusts, yogurts, matches, banknotes, paper, and cardboard glue. Her intestines are used in the strings for musical instruments and rackets, her bones and charcoal ash for refining sugar in ceramics and cleaning and polishing compounds. Medical and scientific uses abound, and there is much, much more. We are dependent upon animals for our welfare and for our thriving. The animal rights movement is not pro-animal. Animal welfare movement is pro-animal. The constant challenge for us to improve our treatment of animals. When we can stop using animals in research, we should stop using animals in research. But to go down the animal liberation, animal rights line is anti-human, because it denies human exceptionalism with the consequences we've just only touched upon to human liberty, and because it would cause tremendous harm to the human race. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, sir.
Let me get the microphone here.
With regard to the infanticide in Netherlands,
Yep.
I wish you would expand on that a little bit. Specifically, does it include abortion as infanticide?
No.
And if not, are there how do they define it, and are there any constraints?
The question is whether that statistic I quoted includes abortion. It does not. Some bioethicists have actually called infanticide post-birth abortion. This is from the Lancet. There were two studies, July 26, 1997, and a follow-up in 2005, that says that infants, this is neonatal children, 8% of all infants who die each year are killed by doctors. That's about 80 to 100 a year are killed each year. It's based sometimes on terminal illness and sometimes on not having what's called a livable life. That's a quality of life judgment, meaning that these babies would be disabled. According to the studies, 45% of neonatologists have killed babies and 31% of pediatricians in the Netherlands have killed babies. In the Netherlands, that kind of infanticide, because obviously babies can't choose to be killed, is technically murder. Nothing is really ever done about it. In fact, there was a recent case in which a doctor was convicted of this and got 2 weeks suspended sentence. Most of the time, there is nothing done, no criminal trials brought, and in fact, when these trials are brought, they're not aimed at putting the doctors in jail, but creating precedents. The response, there was a Groningen protocol where a hospital admitted to killing 20 infants, and the response was the positive reports in the New England Journal of Medicine, the positive reports in the New York Times and so forth, and the Netherlands Parliament is seriously now considering legalizing infanticide for these kinds of conditions. See, once you say that life doesn't have intrinsic value and you base life on a quality of life issue, quality of life ethic, which is what the bioethics mainstream view proposes, then if you don't match up to that quality of life, you may end up not living at all. Ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you have any knowledge of a report I read that in the Netherlands, the doctors were given the legal right to override a parent's decision on whether or not to do what you could medically to sustain the life of any child 12 or under, that they could, in fact, choose to end a child's life.
There are two things involved in this. The first is whether or not children 12 or under could be euthanized. They can with parental, or they are, let's put it this way, with parental consent. There was an attempt to reduce the age of consent to be euthanized to age of 12. That didn't work. Right now I think it's 16. Doctors in the United States, as well as in the Netherlands, are beginning to presume the right to refuse wanted life-sustaining treatment. This is called medical futility or futile care theory. And the way it works is this, in this country, and it's, by the way, they've had some big futile care fights, public fights in Texas. If a doctor believes that the quality of a life of a patient is such that he or she does not wish to provide this life-sustaining treatment, and the family of that patient or even the advance directive stands in the way of removing the life support, then under these futile care theory protocols that are being put in place in hospitals around the country, the dispute would go to a bioethics committee in the hospital for what's called adjudication. It turns it into a quasi-judicial proceeding behind closed doors. If the ethics committee under these protocols believes that the patient's life, that it is, quote, inappropriate to provide the treatment, then the treatment will be cut off unilaterally regardless of what the patient or the family might say. Now, it's important for us to understand what is meant here by futile care, F-U-T-I-L-E. There is something called physiological futility, meaning that the treatment doesn't provide the benefit that the patient requests. And let me give you a very wild example just to illustrate the point. Let's say I went to my doctor with an earache and I said, "Doc, gosh, my ear is hurting, take out my appendix." Well, of course, the doctor is going to say, I'm not going to take out your appendix, Wesley. It would be futile to do so. It could cause you harm because it would do nothing for your ear. That would be the doctor's obligation not to take out my appendix. Let's say, a little more realistic, I went to the doctor with a gut ache, and I said, oh man, my stomach hurts. We do the tests. Doctor says, well, Wesley, you've got a ulcer. Let's take some Maalox. And I decide, no, I've got cancer. Give me chemo. The doctor's going to say, no, we're not going to give you chemo because that will not benefit your ulcer. A very common form of physiological futile treatment is when a patient with a viral infection goes to the doctor and asks for an antibiotic. Doctors should not give an antibiotic for a viral infection because an antibiotic will do nothing for a viral infection, therefore bacterial infections. However, sometimes doctors do as a PR matter or hoping that the placebo effect will kick in and maybe help the patient. But that is one of the reasons we are beginning to have resistant bacteria to antibiotics, and that could become a real problem in the future. That's not what I'm talking about when I deal with futile care theory. What I'm talking about is sometimes called qualitative futility. And let me give you an example. Let's say the Terry Schiavo case. Let's say that Michael Schiavo, Terry's putative husband, and her family agreed she should keep the feeding tube. But the doctor said, no, her quality of life isn't worth living. We want to remove the feeding tube. Why would that feeding tube have been removed in that case? Because it worked? No. I'm sorry, because it didn't work? No, but because it did work. So in qualitative futility, you're taking away treatment that does have the chance or is providing the benefit you want. Therefore, in essence, it isn't the treatment that's futile, it's the patient. And that's what's so dangerous, and futile care theory comes into play when you say no to the question I posed. I don't know the details of whether that is happening in the Netherlands, but I can tell you it's happening in the United States. Not very many places, but it's posed. This is going to be, I think, the next big legal fight. And I predict that the very papers that editorialized about taking away patients' feeding tubes because it was an intimate family decision will then say, well, of course, doctors should decide this issue because families get filled with guilt and they can't make these decisions for themselves. That makes no sense logically or consistently unless the issue isn't treatment, if the issue is death. To get certain patients dead because of their low quality of life or their cost to society. That's what happens when you accept a utilitarian basis. I see why I'm so much fun at parties. Everybody's going, oh. Ma'am.
Okay, I have hopefully two quick questions. The man you mentioned, Gary Francione and
Yes.
others, I mean, on the one hand, they think that an animal has all these rights, but do any of them at least have some internal consistency in terms of, say, unborn or humans?
Well, it's interesting. I must say that Gary Francione does oppose violence. I should have made that point very clear. He has come out vocally against violence, and that has needs to be pointed out. I've never heard a major animal rights activist get into those issues. PETA just wrote a letter to Hamas, I think, or it might have been Hezbollah, upset because there's a TV show in which animals are abused. And of course that's important. We shouldn't allow animal abuse, but they don't write letters when people are blown up. So it's very odd. They wrote when a donkey was used in a terrorist attack by somebody associated with the Palestinian cause, and Ingrid Newkirk, the head of PETA, wrote a letter to the head of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, decrying the death of the donkey. I mean, it's a very odd situation. Peter Singer, who is the godfather, you might say, he wouldn't like that term, but godfather, but he started the animal liberation movement. He's the one who says that animals' interests should be considered equally to humans. He's the world's biggest and most famous proponent of personhood theory that I described. He's also the world's foremost proponent of legalizing infanticide. And why should a baby be able to be killed, according to Peter Singer? Not because the baby is disabled. That's the example he uses, but that's not the reason. The reason Peter Singer believes a baby should be allowed to be killed is because the baby is purportedly not a person. So I don't think they get into that too much.
And then one other question was, so what do you think motivates these people? I don't mean just somebody who, the average person who thinks animals should be treated
Yeah, the
humanely.
average person who believes in animal rights really just wants to make sure animals are treated nicely, But what motivates the deeply committed leaders, I think, is a sense of nihilism and anti-humanity. I think it is very close to the anarchist movement of the 19th and early 20th century. It is about tearing down and not about building up. And I think, this is just Smith on these people, I don't know their hearts, but I think some of them anyway, certainly not all of them, but some of them, particularly the ones who engage in violence, are using the animals as a pretext for the viciousness and the anti-human. You had it here in the riots a few years ago. You saw the anarchists, who are often also the same people who hang out with the radical animal liberationists. There's a sense of tearing down, of anti-humanity, of nihilism, and I think of despair. I think there's a great deal of despair in these folks. They're just always angry. And it would be interesting to get them on a couch sometime.
I recall reading a book by Mortimer Adler
Yes.
called The Difference of Man.
Yes, I've read that book.
And there he makes the case that the difference of man from animals is that it's not a difference in degree, but rather in kind. And I think we tend to agree with that. Now, read a book 10 years back by the Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland talking on logic. And so this was one of the examples he gave, and he said about, for example, a dog, when it's following a scent and it comes to a fork in a road, it smells and goes to it takes one end of the fork, and it finds that the scent is not there. It doesn't smell the other, but it intuitively knows and that it has to be the other one. And so he just makes this passing comment that even dogs can make a logical deduction of that small kind. Now, suppose an animal rights person brought that example up and said, it's not a difference in kind, it's just a difference in degree. How would we answer that?
Well, I think that the difference in kind or difference in degree argument that Adler made has some deficiencies in it, because even if there is a difference of degree, look at the degree. I mean, my gosh, there comes a point where a difference in degree becomes a difference in kind. And I don't think that matters. What matters is that we are the only species that could even engage in that discussion. We're the only species that has actually taken a step outside of the tooth and claw of Darwinian survival and altered nature instead of being bound to nature. We're the only species that has become so fully conscious, whether it's by evolution or whether it was by creation. Take your pick, it doesn't matter to me. We're the only ones who are so conscious and able to project that we can go to the moon. This idea that there might be similar, you see this a lot, in fact, in this book, a chimpanzee can do something that a child can do. Therefore, the chimpanzee is the moral equivalent of the child. It's not true. You have to take the entire capacity of humans. That's what matters. And secondly, they like to play what I call the philosopher and the dupe. And the philosopher this is how the game is played. All right, you think being human is special. What makes being human special? Let's say, well, only humans have articulate language. Well, not all humans have language, so that means that the humans who cannot speak are not as valuable as the humans who can speak. Well, value is species-wide. If we're going to have human rights, it has to be based on an objective standard of humanity. Otherwise, each and every one of us are going to have to earn our rights as personhood theory requires. Today, I'm a person. I walk out in the street and get hit on the head, and maybe I become unconscious and semi-conscious. Perhaps then I'm not a person according to this theory. That means every moment, I have to be earning my rights if you say no to the question I posed. So I think that, there's almost this desperate desire to find ways in which animals are like people. And you might find a little thing here and a little thing there. Yeah, a chimpanzee uses a stick and he opens up a hole to go after termites. So he's a tool user. And that's like this microphone. Give me a break. It's just sophistry. And it's a desperate ideological desire to take us off the pedestal. And let me finish with this point. If we go down that road, we're not going to elevate humans to the level of people. We're going to reduce people to the level of animals. And that's precisely how we will act. Thank you all very much.